Welcome back to Media Talks TV with your host, Tony J. I want to jump into a topic today that, you know, since it's January, we're not too far away from Dr. King's birthday. And I wanted to talk about a topic that some people might find controversial, but we have to have the conversation because for me, this is about accountability. And when I talk about accountability, it's not to suggest that any one person is accused of wrongdoing, but what I mean by accountability is holding generations to the decisions that they made. And when I talk about generations, I'm talking about the post civil rights generation. Now, when I talk about the post civil rights generation, what I mean by that is those that were born between 1954 and 1965. And why is that important? Because this particular cohort within this generation that was born was the forebearers of the civil rights movement, and they gained certain privileges that most people wish they had in the time period that they were born in. Now, it's not to dismiss a whole generation to say that they didn't struggle or they didn't get it as hard as we did. Now, I'm a millennial, and I my when I say post civil rights generation, I'm talking about my parents, I'm talking about my aunts, uncles, anybody that's in your family that was born between 1954 and 1965. Everybody else after 1965, well, they're kind of separate apart. That would be Gen X, because Gen X is kind of like sandwiched between us. But I was watching television this weekend on a New Year's weekend, and they did a reposting of this movie called The Corner. Now, if any of you are familiar with that movie or that miniseries, hit the comment box. Um, it was on Black Tree TV. It was streaming over the weekend. But I know this series all too well because it's about my hometown, Baltimore. And people don't know that that show came before what you now know as The Wire. And if y'all are familiar with The Wire, I don't need to go into detail about that because everybody done saw The Wire. But I'm talking about the particular show that came before the popularity of The Wire, when, at a time period, um, the year 2000, this was when the show came out. And it was like a mini series, 6 episodes altogether, to talk about the drug culture in Baltimore. And I remember when that show came out, I was about 10 years old, and the popularity of it was so high that, people in the barbershops were talking about The Corner and how big that show was for HBO. Um, as you know, many of you might not have come from Baltimore. Some of you probably grew up in maybe DC or other cities similar to my city. Um, the drug culture was so vicious during my time period that I was growing up. Baltimore is so far removed from uh, what what it once was, which was the Wild West. You know, my mother used to call Baltimore when she was growing up the gunfight at OK Corral because of the amount of shootings that would happen in East Baltimore. And I would hear these stories, and my father would tell me stories about how bad Baltimore really was. But, you know, in the 90s, it got so bad in Baltimore that so many cops were afraid to run in the Flag House projects and Murphy Homes and Lexington Terrace. And people were afraid it was like a fucking war zone. And so much of that, you know, it's been glossed over because people don't talk about it as much as they used to. During my time period, Kirk Smoke was the mayor of Baltimore. And Baltimore was going through deep, deep policy changes. And I remember very vividly how he hired, well, Kirk Smoke had hired the Nation of Islam, Fruit of Islam, to actually safeguard the community as a kind of like a response to community policing in the projects. They would have the FOI standing outside the doors of public housing projects. And that became a very controversial thing in Baltimore. It became worldwide news because hiring anybody from the Nation of Islam at that time was considered, you know, career suicide. But to my main point about the movie The Corner, you saw in that movie a multi generational family get destroyed by the culture of drugs. And so many people around me, I knew about the drug culture in Baltimore because I grew up around it, surrounded by it. Um, but that begs to ask the question, you know, some of the people in that show were 35, 25 years, well, 35 to 45 years old, which means they had to have been born in the late 50s to mid 60s. And you see how the older generation of kids end up turning out, and then you see DeAndre, who is about 15, get wrapped up in the drug culture by selling drugs. And what was so poignant about that show was how one generation got swallowed up after another. I couldn't be remiss to talk about, you know, the character Fat Kirk, whom is representative of everything that destroyed him in the show, but he was the one that outlived all of them. While he watched a whole generation of them die off, he was the last one in the show to actually outlive his drug addicted friends and die in a retirement home. And that's crazy to think, you know, we are the culmination of the decisions that we make. And I remember this quote that James Baldwin said, and I love this quote by James Baldwin. I read a lot of James Baldwin going through college, but he said, people pay for what they do, and they do so abundantly by the lives that they lead, simply by the lives that they lead. And I remember requoting that over and over again because I realize every decision that I make in my life has a consequence. But because we don't make the right decisions as black folks, we don't have the foresight. And that's what I partially blame the that generation of kids who are now elderly and are getting close to their touching their 70s and their mid 70s. A lot of our parents have a very big lack of foresight. And you could blame it on whatever you want to blame it on. But ultimately, our parents got us exactly where we are today. And I know people are going to be out there and they're going to say, "Oh, you need to stop blaming your parents. You need to stop blaming the previous generation because they blame us for everything else. They blame us for why we can't get jobs. They blame us for why we can't get certain resources in our community. But the very ones that benefited from the Civil Rights Act, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, they got a taste of affirmative action and they were able to put themselves in a position to be successful. But it's because certain groups made choices and didn't think about the future. They only thought about right now. They only thought about getting money, but not investing it. And that's what I want to really talk to the FBAs about. We call ourselves foundational Black Americans. FBAs. I don't care if you be one or FBA, but we all in the same boat together because of generational curses and generational trauma um that was brought upon us by the decisions that we made, well, that they made in the past. You know, um, I was reading this book called "When Crack Was King," and I remember it's a book. I encourage everybody to get this book too. You know, "When Crack Was King" by Donovan Ramsey, and it's on Amazon Prime, Amazon.com. I can get the Kindle version or you get the Audible version, but I encourage every last one of y'all to listen to that book or actually get out there and read it, When Crack Was King by Donovan Ramsey. And some of us, when I think about all the stuff, the culture that's surrounded by the drug economics that they created, I say to myself and I ask myself time after time, you can't be the victim and the victimizer. You can't have it both ways. And a lot of the people from the crack epidemic who are our parents, and I'm not saying everybody was involved in the drug trade. I want to make that point very abundantly clear. I'm not saying everybody was in the drug trade. But some of you who were born during that time period have made bad decisions and have made the worst type of decisions because you felt as though you were doing the right thing. And the one thing that the decisions that we've made all had to circle around money and having a bunch of material things that we never had and trying to accumulate things that we never had because we were tired of being poor. And the trauma that came with it is this continued survival mindset that most black folks have. Our parents had survivalist mentalities that even today does not work for us. Now, I was born in 1990 in Baltimore, and Baltimore was just the way that I researched it. Baltimore was turning a corner where they had started having 300 murders a year. And 1990 was the worst year for Baltimore. And while being born in the midst of this, you know, we are, as Generation Y, victims of our parents' decision of our parents' bad decision making. You can't say that the roadmap wasn't given to them because they had the advantage. And when you have the advantage, you get to make better decisions. It's in your hands. But most of our parents, and you have to admit this, most of our parents did not make the right decisions on our behalf. And so we're now stuck with the realities of the decisions that they made in the past. And every time I see somebody that's 65 or 70 years old talk to me or lecture me about how I should live my life, I have to ask them this question too. What makes you think your way is the right way? And sometimes we never question our elders. We were taught young we were taught real young never to talk back or never to speak back to our elders, never to question our elders' authority. But because we never really pushed back, because millennials never pushed back against certain dogmas or belief systems that our parents were passing down to us, we became wrapped up in a bad system, playing out the same scripts that work for them but no longer work for us. And then all the time, it's always the blame the white man thing. But you gained an advantage that most people during that time period, I mean, that we didn't have in our current stage of life. So when you think about how our parents were able to get factory jobs, they benefited from that. They had a job in their hometown. They were able to get a check every day and pay rent that was about $300 a month. Now imagine that. You're working at a company and you're getting paid $700 to $800 a month and your rent is only like $300. That's not bad considering you're able to afford a lifestyle that most people can't. no more. Our parents reaped the benefit from the 70s and the 80s because those jobs were already there. I hear a lot of 65 to 70-year olds. They say, well, millennials and kids of my generation, they have it easier than they did. But all of that what they're talking about is about this thing about this idea about work that most black people, we still kind of are stuck on. And this primary generation, when everything was said and done, when the civil rights era was over and they were going into the 70s, and then that means most of our parents were teenagers during the 70s. What did they choose to do? They chose to do drugs. They chose to sell drugs. They chose to rob and kill people for drugs. And then they say, and they grow up, they say our generation was worse. And every time I hear 65 to 70-year olds talk about back in the day, I tune it out for the simple fact that when they talk about certain things that come out of their era, they only talk about the positive things. They never talk about the negative things or the dirt that they did on their end. It's kind of like when you have a nostalgia and you only want to remember the good things, but you don't want to talk about the bad things. Our parents had black exploitation films, and every image in black exploitation films was pimps, drug dealers, and killers. Pimps, drug dealers, and killers. And all of that imagery, you know, led to the drug culture of the 70s. People selling weed and heroin, pills, experimenting with pills. Our parents messed around with cocaine. They partied and they spent exorbitant when they got their first job, they spent exorbitant amounts of money on cars they couldn't afford. And they had the advantage. And it's kind of twofold, right? So I'm talking about those that made the bad decisions. Now I'm going to talk about those that made the good decisions. You had young black people in the 70s going to college. They had the advantage. They go to law school. They get into the mentality of going for white corporate jobs. The so-called, Reginald F. Lewis's and the Vernon Jordans of our time. And those are what we call that's a part of the civil rights generation. But then there's another part, right? Then there's another part. There's another part of the civil rights generation that we don't talk about, and then as like affirmative action, right? And with affirmative action, you saw black people working at big name corporations, and they were making a lot of money. They were making a lot of money, and they could afford the luxuries of life that they couldn't afford when they were poor and they were either in the projects or in the fields. Then when they get to this status, they think that the gravy train is going to last, and that's the downfall of that generation, that side of the generation that made the right decisions. They thought that the gravy train was going to last, so they went into the 80s and then the 90s and then the 2000s. And when 2008 came, they lost everything. My aunt was a part of that generation. Successful, made the right decisions, but in the very end, lost everything because it was tied to a white corporate structure. And I got a lot of lectures back then by those very people about how to make the right decisions, come in on time, wear a suit and tie, you know, make sure you speak in proper English, say yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And that generation, it worked for them because they were able to get money, but only a select few blacks were able to break through that glass ceiling. That's why we had Obama. That's why we have Kamala Harris, because they were able to break through. And then they send these two people back to our communities and then tell us how we should live our lives as young millennials. Like they were there, put there to lecture us on how to be successful like them. But they don't even realize that they signed themselves up to be tokens. And a lot of those token blacks that are in their 60s and 70s now, like the Oprahs and the Kamala Harrises and the Obamas, they're the worst thing that happened to black Americans. Whether you believe me or not, they are the generation of kids that benefited from affirmative action. And now, when we try to get into the workforce, those barriers now coming back to block us even more. And that's probably one of the reasons why I've never really grown to I've kind of grown to be disassociative of the Obama era, because the Obamas represented something that wasn't real, something that actually didn't typify progress. And a lot of people saw through that even with Kamala Harris. And I talked about that a long time ago. You could look at one of my lives. They had this mixed upbringing and they get this uh advantage that most kids in their neighborhoods didn't get. Most lighter complected kids that I knew growing up got better advantages than people that look like me. They got to go to Harvard Law. They got to go to the Ivy. But somewhere down the line, they thought that their progress meant progress for all of us. And that's one of the mentalities that has been a part of the post civil rights generation for a very long time, that just because one made it through doesn't necessarily mean everybody else going to make it through. They might just accept one person and then shut out the rest. I grew up reading Black Enterprise magazine, reading Jet magazine and Ebony magazine, and those things represented Black progress in the sense that it represented that Black people had officially made it, that they could afford the American dream, that they could afford housing. I grew up and I had family in Washington, D.C. They were a part of the Marion Barry era where they saw Black middle class, where they could own homes in Fort Washington, where they could own homes in Hyattsville. Some of them still do now. They can't afford them. They can't afford any of those houses. There was one point where I wanted to go to Howard. I couldn't afford to get into Howard. There was a time period where I wanted to live in Mitchellville, Maryland, because they had all these big houses in Mitchellville, Maryland. I thought that, being in PG County and living in PG County, that was a dream of mine, because I was like, yo, that's the Black middle class. Like, if I could make it there and out of Baltimore, I've actually achieved something that nobody else in my family would be able to achieve. But then you go on Zillow, and then you go on homes.com, and you see how all of these homes that are in PG County and Montgomery County are now $1.5 million, $680,000. A 3-bedroom home is now $790,000. The shit's insane. But then you got parents that are 70, 75-year olds telling us, well, you need to work hard. You just need to save up. You need to, and then you got those delusional ass niggas. Oh, you need to call on Jesus. You know, same delusional ass motherfuckers, but they ruined it for a whole entire generation. You know why? Because they never built anything. They never built anything, but they stay blaming white folks for the decision making process that they made. If I'm going to be in somebody's house and I'm eating off their table, right? If I'm eating off their table and it's not my fucking table, do you expect them to keep letting me sit at the table for a long time to eat? No, it's not going to happen. And you know why it's not going to happen? Because the fucking table isn't yours. All these black folks that all these post generation, post civil rights generation black folks gained an advantage and squandered it all. That's why I talk about baby boomers a lot, and I feel like, me being at the age, I think it's time for millennials and start going really hard on baby boomers, because now they're at a position where now we got to take care of their ass. Now we got to put off everything, all prime working years, because they're continuing to be in the workforce more. Then when they get sick, now they want us to take care of them, but they never took care of us. They never looked out for us. All they cared about was the drugs and the money and the cars and the fast cars and the brick phones and the pages and all that other shit. That's all they cared about. The big screen TVs, the big houses. They wanted it all. They wanted that middle class American dream, and they got it. They got it under Bill Clinton. They got it under George W. Bush. We didn't get it under Obama. And he was supposedly be the first, he was supposedly the first black president, but yet he's the one that told us, oh, keep fighting, keep fighting. And then at the end of it all, we kept fighting, and he never did not a damn thing for black Americans. And it's hard to say that shit because, yeah, we're taught to deify these people just like we're taught to deify Dr. King. Nobody wants to question Dr. King. Nobody wants to question Obama. But they all made decisions that have an impact on the next generation. And I know a lot of people going to say, well, it was the white establishment, it was benign neglect, it was certain policy changes under the Reagan administration. I've heard them all. I've heard the new Jim Crow. I've heard this thing about, mandatory minimum sentencing for 1 gram of rock. I've heard that shit. I've heard about Len Bias and what that led to. But you got to openly admit some of this shit is on y'all grandparents. Some of this shit is on them. And they're probably sitting in the living room right now watching this video right along with you. You look at them and you think about what they've done to put us in this position. They hurt your future. They hurt our future. And now they're looking for a retirement party or retirement. And yet, some of them have made the most horrid decisions. And it's split two ways because both of them didn't do good. One generation accepted tokenism and didn't build any businesses. The other side of the generation, the other end of the post civil rights generation, they wanted the drugs and the fast money and the fast cars and all this other shit, and they're barely hanging on to whatever they have. Or some of them are probably dead or in a wheelchair for the rest of their life because they caught a bullet, or just getting out of jail at 65 years old, like Maurice King and Rayful Edmond. A lot of those people created chaos for all of us. And yet, we hear that they're the victims all the time in the media. But the reality is, they're the ones that created all this chaos for the next generation, like us, people like me, to clean up. And the stress of it all is sometimes unbearable because there's nothing that can really fix it. But the one thing that we can fix at this moment is to call it for what it is. To not allow these smug individuals, because that's who they are, because at this point, because they make smug derogatory comments about a whole generation of young people like me, saying that, well, you just didn't put forth the effort, or you didn't work hard enough. And back in my day, I got my first apartment at 16 and 15 years old. Who the fuck has their first apartment at 15 and 16 years old? And you can't co-sign for an apartment. In fact, they make it more harder now for people to get apartments now because of income. But you remember, these are the same generation of people that thought it was okay to kick kids out at 18 years old. And it's always been a black thing. It's always been a black thing to kick your kids out at 18 years old. Something that is a part of the economic trauma in America. But one of the main things with that previous generation that I highly detest, we talk about black unity, but how do you espouse black unity when you're kicking your kids out at 18 years old, or when you're kicking your son or your daughter out at that age without the tools to manage their finances or economics? And they say, well, I made a way. You can make a way for yourself. So get out the mud mentality. Figure it out. And then when you got your shit together now they want you to take care of them. They want to move in your house. They want to move, you know, everything into your house, and they want you to take care of them now after they threw you to the wolves. But yet they got a chance to build wealth. But like I said, their priorities were about getting as much money and accumulating shit that wasn't important, depreciating assets that weren't important because they were okay with the flash. You look at the pictures that they have. You look at all the pictures that they have with their flashy suits on, women walking around with fur minks, them posing in nightclubs, sitting in that little, that famous Black Power Wiccan chair, that Wick chair. Every black family got that Wiccan chair, that Wick chair. You know what the fuck I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. I ain't boo boo the fool. They got that chair in your house right now. They were posing with minks on and nice leather shoes and leather boots. They got to enjoy their life. They got to enjoy every aspect of their life, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. We can't enjoy our lives because we so busy trying to survive. So now it's like we back on survival mode now. Everybody's back to trying to survive, trying to make themselves to get to a point where they could survive on their own. But what I want to say is don't ever let these 60 to 70-year olds try to fucking lecture you on how to live your life. Because a lot of them want to make us feel guilty. They want to make us feel guilty for the decisions that they made in their lives. It's like the tale of two letters. They don't want to say and openly admit to their sons and their daughters to say, I'm sorry, I failed you. Because ultimately they all think, and they smug, they think they made the right decisions. But they didn't. And when everything is snatched away from us, we're to blame. Now I don't see how you could blame a whole generation of young kids that are just getting out of college trying to get their life on track. I don't see how you could blame millennials, kids that were born in the 90s, early 90s, and early 2000s. How you could blame them for the decisions that our parents made. Every decision has a consequence. And with the post civil rights generation, the biggest problem and the biggest weakness that generation has is a lack of foresight. They didn't plan for the future, they only plan for right now. And that's why we got the shit that we have right now, because they didn't plan for the future. They didn't leave us any roadmap or blueprint to be successful. And instead of admitting that they didn't have the blueprint, that they didn't have the foundation, they want to do this. Oh, y'all kids, y'all all think y'all are entitled to something. And really we are. Because isn't the same group of people that said we grow up to be anything we want? We could do anything we wanted to do. I know tomorrow will bring a better you, better me. I know that we'll show this world what we could be. Isn't that the song they made us listen to in school? I hated that song so much because it was a load of bullshit. Because the truth is, there was no tomorrow. Tomorrow only belongs to those who prepare for it today. And nobody prepares for tomorrow. We only prepare, we only prepare for right now. And I feel like now that generation, now that we're paying for the mistakes of that generation, The only thing I ask my generation is to don't make the same mistake that your parents made. Don't make the same fucking mistake. Don't think that everything is going to be there tomorrow. Everything in this fucking world is temporary. And that's something that I had to learn. Everything that we get, whether it be a job or a career or a woman or a car or a house, you could lose it today or tomorrow. And you know, the foolish assumption about that previous generation is they assumed that their jobs were going to be around for them for the long haul. They thought their kids was going to work in the steel mill. They thought their kids was going to work at the GM Ford company. Then by 1989, they was laying off 700,000 people, regular working folk in places like Chicago, Gary, Indiana, Dayton, Ohio. They thought their jobs was going to be there. My father assumed the same exact thing. My father worked in factories. I remember my mother used to drive me up to the factory, worked in a uniform factory, and I knew those jobs weren't going to be around. It was just like you saw what our parents was doing, but our parents didn't factor in that they could lose their job today or tomorrow. You think that the job is going to be there for you, but you know, even I thought, when my father was working at the synagogue, I thought that by the time I graduated out of high school, I was going to have a job already lined up for me, working under my father. That didn't happen. Didn't happen at all. You could think you're FBA all you want, but the biggest issue as Black Americans is we assume that white people are going to continue letting us eat at their table. That's the biggest issue. You think you're going to continue eating at the table when in reality they only let you eat at the table because they had this guilt of not letting you eat at the table. And that was brought on by policy. Dr. King worked very hard to get the policies changed, but even he admitted that he might have been short sighted in how he approached economics and understanding how certain systems are baked in to keep a lot of us out of it. And when we don't build anything for our children and the children's children, we end up right along in that same boat with the same survival mentalities that our parents had. Nobody made you choose to sell heroin. That was a decision that you made. Nobody made you sell crack. That was a decision that you made through circumstances that compelled you to focus on fast money instead of building something for yourself. And a lot of us could build something for ourselves, but we choose not to. I feel like not lot of us focus on venture capital or having venture capital. I think that needs to change. Because if we could pull our monies for these other resources like we always do, like you have United Negro College Fund, if you could pull your money for that, then you could pull your money for venture capital. Why don't we have our own black tech firms? Why don't we have our own apps? That's crazy. All this money out here that we could be getting, but we tend to focus on wanting to eat off the table of white establishments. And that's the first thing. Like when you call yourself FBA, exactly what are you trying to do to build platforms so that we could be able to not have to depend on these companies that really want to silence our voice. Like I said, going back to the older generation, they didn't build anything for any of us, but they have so much to say about how to live a good life. They sit up here, they give lectures, they lecture you, they lecture me, but how much of this shit actually works in our favor? It don't. I remember when I first started looking for jobs, they said, "Oh, you gotta work yourself up. You gotta work yourself from the ground. You gotta start at the bottom." Meanwhile, somebody that don't have no degree, no background, no work experience get the top paying jobs. But yet the older generation, the ditch diggers and the fucking factory workers, they all say, "Well, you gotta start at the bottom and work your way up. Yeah, work your way up. You're being too entitled. You have entitlement issues." I'm like, get the fuck out of here. I wish the whole lot of them just go away, just disappear from society because they're not helping you and I. They're not helping anybody. They're actually hurting us. They're doing more damage. They have done more damage to millennials and Gen Z combined. They they don't give two rats asses about the damage that they've done. But we're taught that we have to revere them. We were raised off of fear. We feared our elders. That's why we're in the situation that we're in. We fear them and they put the fear of God in us not to push against the bullshit that they were putting out. And we paid the ultimate price for that reverence. And that's why I have no ounce of fucking respect for them. Period. because the way society is going now, they're the forebearers of the decisions that they made on behalf of society. And like I said, they had a benefit. They were able to make all this money in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And then when they had all that money, they squandered it on drugs, expensive houses, and expensive cars that they couldn't afford. Only thing I ask for my generation and for the people that's watching this video is to not make the same fucking mistake our parents made. Don't buy houses or cars that are more expensive, that are so expensive that you can't afford it or you getting foreclosed on. Don't buy shit just to impress your friends, and don't get into any illicit activities just so you can make quick cash, because quick cash equal quick death. And that's why it's so fundamentally important to look to remember your history and remember that these people have such a short-sightedness about them that they're not even willing enough to admit that certain decisions led to a whole generational downfall. You got kids of crack babies who have now grown up, still have mental development disabilities because their mothers chose to smoke crack and drink alcohol while they were giving birth. I had to go to school with a lot of these kids. These kids had developmental problems, fighting, hurting other people, lashing out at teachers, throwing desks and chairs. Our parents loved to drink. They loved to drink Johnny Walker. They loved to drink Coke 45 and King Cobra. That was the most drinkingest, smokingest generation. And then I end up having fucking asthma, childhood asthma that I still got to this day because of them fucking kid, because of them fucking parents, them older that older generation that like to smoke, drink, and play pinochle and poker. Had gold tooth in their mouth and shit, sitting out on a corner drinking old English. That generation. A generation that left guns on the table while their kids was running around the house. That generation. But now they want to be in their 70s and their 80s lecturing you like C. Dolores Tucker lectures young black kids. They all want to do that. They all want to be a lecturer. They all want to be fucking preachers and when I was growing up and I saw them, they was like 45, 50 years old. They all became, after they did all the wild shit that they did, what did they do? They go into church, they become deacons and deaconesses and shit, and then want to go and pontificate about how all of us was living in sin. So then it ties into the church, the black church, and one of the reasons why a lot of the youth in my age category don't want to go to church no more. We don't want to go to no more black churches no more because of them. You think about that for a minute. Because we got tired of getting fucking lectured at 11 and 12 years old talking about we was living in sin. Talking about we was living in sin because we watched Bow Wow movies and shit. Bow Wow music videos. That same generation, they all wanted to fucking lecture us. I want to talk about we living in sin, but you the biggest sinner. You the biggest fucking sinners around, y'all. The biggest, ain't no bigger hypocrite. Let me tell you something. Ain't no bigger hypocrite than a fucking parent. No bigger hypocrite. A preacher and a parent are nothing but the biggest fucking hypocrites of all time. And they chose to be like this. They chose to be like this because they wanted to sweep their dirty shit under the rug. By the time I got 11 and 12 years old and we was around them, they tried to instill fear into us. And we never pushed back on that shit. We never pushed back on that trauma. And a lot of that post civil rights generation, they traumatized us because they were traumatized when they were kids too. But it was more of an emotional trauma than a physical one. Now, I'm not saying I'm the only one that got whoopings, and I'm like I said, I wasn't the kid that always got whoopings and stuff like that, but I did get scolded. I got fussed at. But a lot of them, a lot of them did a lot of dirty shit that they're not willing to admit to. A lot of them had the advantage and they had the opportunities. They had the advantage, they had the opportunities, but they still want to come up at the age that they are and claim they are a fucking victim of the system that they created for themselves. Now, I'm not talking about 80 and 90-year-old people, the civil rights generation that had to break those barriers. I'm talking about those who came after them because they had the world in their fucking hands. They could go to white school if they wanted to. They can go to a predominantly white institution because constitutional laws, Brown versus Board of Education, help to destigmatize that. They had the advantage. Then by the time the 80s got here, they made the worst fucking decision of all time. And this is twofold. They sold crack and they voted for Ronald Reagan. And the two of them things melded together created the conditions that reverberate through our generation today. This bad decision making, but them want to lecture you. Preachers the same fucking way. Lecture you, then behind closed doors do dirt. You know, there was a reason why, and I say this with all the respect and reverence for Dr. King, because I know, January is going to be his birthday. But what exactly did we benefit from Dr. King? I mean, we had the Voting Rights Act and we had the Civil Rights Act, but then at the same time, did we ever economically grow from that era? And most people say no. Most people will say no. And I would also have to agree with that sentiment as well. When you look through history, everybody likes to say, well, black folks, what the benefit of Dr. King's success was that we were able to push our culture through film and music. But that's kind of like the only downside to it. We don't have a lot of black doctors. We don't have a lot of black lawyers. Only the top people, only the very top are black lawyers, but very few have actually gotten into law school. Mainly because the reason why we don't have enough black lawyers is because of our educational system. And you can't just blame that on white people. Like I said, they were in positions of power in the 80s and 90s. In the Baltimore City public school system, one which I went to, they were in positions of power. I didn't see no white men at my school. I saw black superintendents. I saw black principals. I saw black teachers. They all were a part of the system. You got the system and then you squandered it. It's just like in the 80s in my city when they got tired of the white political establishment in Baltimore, we got Kirk Smoke. Kirk Smoke was Yale educated, and yet the city kept consistently having 300 murders until he left office. And then we had a white mayor, and then the murders went down. It's crazy. Some of us aren't willing to admit that that generation was so fucking incompetent. They were incompetent for various reasons. And I never talked about that aspect. You know, it's really time to start putting their feet to the fire because their incompetence causes us resentment because they had the system in their hands. But now we're not able to get into that same system that was built for them. We're not able to get into that system and actually try to change things. Even with our generation, even with the generation that's in front of me, the kids that were born in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s, they're not able to get their foot in the door of establishments because the previous generation has made it hard for them to start gatekeeping. And that's one of the issues as to why the political system continues to be the way that it is. Why we continue to have politicians that's 80, 85 years old trying to run for president because the youth are not able to get into the systems. They have created the system and they've made it to a point of like autocracy. But I'm not going to talk about that on a bigger level because that's another conversation to have. But what I'm talking about with the political system of Black Americans in the United States, and particularly within local government, they have the system. They had the system in Baltimore, and for years it didn't work, and we continue to have the same issues in Baltimore because of the previous generation that made those decisions and made those decisions on behalf of us, and it made us victims to a system that we cannot change. It would take us two generations before we're able to actually impact some type of change to it. But it's also with the post civil rights generation, their mindsets, because they grew up in an era where they barely didn't have anything, but when they did get it, they forgot that there's going to be another generation right in front of them that are going to want to need that system as well. They only thought about themselves in the process. And what I'm asking is make sure, like with our generation, to make sure you think about the people that's coming in front of you and not be self centered and selfish to the point of arrogance and making smug decisions that will actually hurt another group of people for generations to come. Because now, with the post civil rights generation dying off, those that's born in 1954 to 1965 dying off with the quickness, we now got to clean up their fucking mess. Whether that be bills and debt under their name gets passed down to the son or the daughter, fucked up credit ratings, messed up homes. They talk about, well, you inherited the home, so it's nothing fun about inheriting a home because you can't fix the shit. Ownership doesn't mean inheritance. Sometimes ownership means that you had to continue the upkeep of the home and fix it up. Whatever problems that come about, you're responsible for taking money out of your fucking pocket to fix it. So they talk about all this shit about wealth transfer. It's not wealth transfer, it's debt transfer for most people. And that's the thing that people don't want to talk about. So while y'all celebrating Dr. King's birthday and talking about I have a dream speech, remember that generation had everything and chose the drug route, to chose to be tokens on one end and crack dealers on the other end. This has been another Media Talks TV, and I'm Tony J. And be sure to subscribe, hit the like button. Please share this video because we need to have this conversation. Because I'm getting sick and tired of that generation. I'm getting sick and tired of them baby boomers, them 1955, 57, 58 babies. I'm getting tired of them motherfuckers. And I know y'all getting tired of their ass too. I'm out. Peace.